Today, the village of Palashi in Bengal is surrounded by marshland. In 1757, it was a simple, open plain with a notable mango grove, where cultivators tilled the soil and enjoyed the literal fruits of their labor. But that very year, it would be transformed from just another open plain into a site named that all Indian and British schoolchildren would recognize as part of their history, Plassey. Plassey, just 100 miles north of Calcutta, was the site where British political power in India was technically born. Little did local cultivators and villagers know that their humble mango grove would bear witness to one of the most significant transformations in Indian politics in the 18th century. In this lecture, we're going to cover three major developments in 18th and early 19th century India. First, we're going to look at Bengal. This is where the company first acquired political power, which had reverberations across the entire Indian subcontinent. Second, we'll examine how the transformation of a merchant venture into a political entity thrust the British into the role of being an Indian political sovereign. Lastly, we're going to assess what the company did with its initial conquests and how it used the legacy of late Mughal tax collection and officers to tax India's agrarian countryside more than any other ruler in its history. But first, let's start with Bengal. The overall state of affairs in 18th century India, its regionalized politics, warfare, and merchant banking families, was exemplified by India's eastern regions. Here, the company was vaulted into power through a two-pronged method. It was the nexus of money and political intrigue coming into one. There was a recipe for British colonialism in Bengal and the rest of India. It contained these ingredients. 1, British action, 2, political chicanery, and 3, jolly good luck. Bengal, which would become the bridgehead for the British in India, is where we see the entire political, military, and economic context of the 18th century really get put into action. But first, let's back up and meet the Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Daulah. Siraj was the grandson of the first Nawab of Bengal, Ali Vardi Khan. Siraj became Nawab in April of 1757. At the time, no one expected that Siraj would become the first Indian ruler to fall to the British. Indeed, he was seen as a child of fortune, having been raised in Ali Vardi's house, groomed for rule, and determined to extend his rule deeper into Bengal's hinterlands and confront the Marathas coming in from central India. But little did Siraj know that the very actions which could make him stronger, and his rule stronger, also opened the possibility for his demise. For his actions set in motion dynamics which would be taken advantage of by the East India Company and usher in the period of British rule. Now, Siraj was determined to consolidate his state's power. He wanted to centralize control and raise a larger army. So he needed money. But he made the mistake, in retrospect, of demanding extended lines of credit from the Jagat Seth banking family. He also demanded greater taxes from the rural elite, who started to resent such demands and encroachments. Now, how do you think the Jagat Seth bankers and rural landlords reacted to Siraj's aggressive demands? Well, as you might expect, like any rational person, they got fed up with it. Over a few years, Siraj greatly alienated the very zamindars and creditors needed to grease the fiscal wheels of any polity. Remember, zamindars needed to remit revenue, and creditors were needed to fill Siraj's fiscal appetite. Siraj also wanted to assert more control over European trade. He demanded that the company halt construction of fortifications at their trading station in Calcutta, which were originally built to repel the French, not Indians. Remember, Siraj was doing what other regional Indian states were doing, consolidating regional autonomy, the fiscal state, and enhancing his armed forces. Now, how do you think the British reacted to Siraj's demand? Exactly. In a fit of British pride, they flat out refused. Plus, Siraj also resented this interference in Bengal's political affairs. He was especially angry when he learned that the British were supporting factions against him in his court. Getting word of the British refusal to comply, coupled with this simmering resentment of their interfering in his affairs, Siraj routed company forces in Calcutta in early 1756. His soldiers took around 60 British prisoners, hostage and detained them in a holding cell. This was the famed, if not somewhat overblown, Black Hole of Calcutta. While later British observers exaggerated the claims of torture and abuse, what was more important was the emotional reaction to this assault on what many saw as an affront to British honor. The British were now thinking of revenge. This is where the character of Robert Clive comes in. He became not only the spearhead of revenge, but also, perhaps unintentionally, one of the founders of the British Empire in India. Now, Clive was an upstart, ambitious young company employee. He came from a family in Shropshire which had a history of public service. And at the age of 19, Clive's father sent him out to India as a company agent, where he got his first taste of the East. In his first 14 years in India, Clive increasingly got involved with company rivalries and regional kingdoms in South India, and he was a promising official in the company's employ. Clive sensed an opportunity. He sailed from the company's post in southern India at Madras to avenge this humiliation of British honor. Since the British were not militarily superior to the Indian states, Clive sought to exploit disillusioned actors in Bengal. He entered into secret negotiations with the Jagat Seths, offering them better prospects and business than their local clients. Clive and these bankers, in turn, then conspired with a disaffected general in Siraj's army, Mir Jafar. So as we can see, Clive was working the existing political and economic landscape in order to pursue British interests. And this brings us to the Battle of Plassey in 1757. In this large mango grove in the Bengal countryside, Siraj's army confronted the company's forces. As battle commenced, Jafar was ordered, as part of his secret negotiation with Clive, to look the other way, and the company won in a proper rout. But the aftermath of the battle was more significant than the battle itself. The company was rewarded with a few things. First, it won 28 million rupees, or over 3 million pounds sterling in 18th century money. Talk about the rewards of war. The company then installed Mir Jafar as the Nawab of Bengal to replace the deposed and defeated Siraj. Now, what do gracious, recently installed rulers do to those who got them there? They usually repay them. This is where the company's fortunes started to change in India. Jafar ceded 24 parganas, which are India's lowest administrative subdivisions, to the company. He gave the company the right to collect the taxes of these 24 parganas. Now, let's stop for a moment. Isn't this crazy? Isn't the company a commercial actor? Well, yes, but it was now changing. The company was becoming a political authority and power. They now had the right to tax, which, as we know, is the ultimate prerogative of any political sovereign. Now, you're probably thinking, what could the East India Company do with this revenue? Well, they could use it for everything, the whole kitchen sink of government and trade. The company could now use this tax revenue not only to fund their army, but also to expand trade. This drastically altered Britain's relationship with India. Now, instead of importing all this silver into India to pay for Indian goods, the company could use Indian revenue to pay for Indian goods. Kind of like free money. A merchant's dream come true. Robert Clive and the company's directors realized they had stumbled upon what was considered an inestimable amount of wealth. Clive called the 24 parganas an inexhaustible fund of riches. Clive and others were turned into the equivalent of 18th century millionaires in the most commercially vibrant part of India. Now, how do you think Bengal's neighboring states reacted to this news of company victory in Bengal? To put it simply, a lot of them were really concerned. Upcountry to the northwest in Bihar, another Nawab, Mir Qasim, came into the picture. Qasim tried to hold the company at bay by centralizing his state and extracting more fiscal revenue from cultivators. Yet Qasim made a crucial mistake. He had some of the Jagat Seth bankers jailed. He then went on to form an informal alliance with the Nawab of Awadh and the Mughal emperor together to confront the company. Now, let's ask ourselves, into whose arms was Qasim pushing the Jagat Seth bankers? You got it right, the British. This alliance worried the British. How could they take on such a formidable group? It was the Mughal emperor, after all. The British viewed Qasim as a threat to their holdings in Calcutta and their very valuable 24 parganas. This led to the Battle of Buxar in 1764 between Qasim and the company. Surprisingly, the company smashed the last strand of armed resistance in eastern India. They proved that they were, militarily, masters of Bengal country. Like Plassey, though, the aftermath of the battle was more significant than the actual conflict itself. 1 year later, in 1765, the Mughal emperor granted what was called the Divan of Bengal to the company. Now, the Divan meant the right to revenue administration, the right to tax. The Mughal emperor had given the company basically ownership of Bengal. They were to administer it on behalf of the Mughal emperor. The emperor, Shah Alam II, reckoned that if he couldn't subdue the British, he might as well allow them to work within the looser imperial system. But think about it. Why was the right to tax so significant? It was a political, not a commercial responsibility. And what did it do, at least potentially, to the company's wallet? It had the potential to make it very fat. The events of 1764 to 1765 were significant for a few reasons. First, the British gained a footing in India's most commercially prosperous region, Bengal. The company now had the revenues of South Asia's richest province. They could pay for goods without having to spend their own money. Second, they were transformed into a political power. The merchants became rulers. They became what one observer, Henry Boltz, called the sovereign merchant/merchant sovereign. Another observer, Thomas Pownall, said the merchant had become the sovereign. It really is one of the oddest political transformations in history. It would be like Microsoft taking over the state powers of California. So if we step back for a moment, we can see that an external power, the company, took advantage of the Mughal regionalized state system. Clive and the company worked the system to take advantage of what was already going on. And since Britain dominated India's long-distance bullion flow and the seas with the Royal Navy, the company had a recipe for becoming the dominant power in South Asia within a generation. So in a way, think about it. The seeds for the British Empire were planted in the marshes and plains of Bengal. Okay, now that we've examined the catapulting of the company to power in Bengal, let's proceed to examine how between 1770 and 1820, the company took advantage of similar dynamics in other parts of India to become the dominant political power on the subcontinent by the time of Napoleon's defeat back in Europe. The British took advantage of pre-existing dynamics in Bengal. We've seen this. But the company was able to replicate this formula in other parts of India. They did this through military fiscalism and working with merchant and banking groups against other regional kingdoms. There was one advantage the British had that other regional kingdoms did not. This was Bengal's revenues, which were considerable. They yielded the company nearly £8 million in 18th century sterling, the modern-day equivalent of billions of dollars of revenue. The company was not only able to pay for Indian goods with Indian wealth, but it was better able to finance wars against other Indian regional states. This was best seen in the wars against the southern kingdom of Mysore. Mysore was one of the most formidable kingdoms of India. It had an impressive military. It was efficiently taxed, and its rulers, Hyder Ali and his son Tipu Sultan, wanted to raise a large army and drive the English into the seas. Ali established state-owned industries and even built a smaller navy to counter the British. But even Ali admitted, quote, "I can ruin their resources by land, but I cannot dry up the sea." Ali was also limited by his dependency upon British arms. In fact, a quarter of all his weapons were of British manufacture. Between 1780 and 1799, the company fought 3 major wars against Mysore. Even though Mysore had 80,000 to the company's 40,000 troops, the company managed to win a final battle in 1799. The company won out not because of superior military technology. It was largely due to logistics. merchants and bankers, seeing a large moving market in their midst, supplied grains to British troops. The company commander, Sir Irakut, even admitted that, quote, a day's rice more or less may decide the fate of the British Empire in India. Now, let's ask ourselves, who back in Europe might be willing to help Mysore against the British? With whom did the British have a long-standing rivalry that punctuated the 18th century? Why the French, of course. And why would the company move so quickly to crush a kingdom aligning with France after 1789? You remember your history. It's the French Revolution. In 1786, Lord Cornwallis became the Governor-General of the East India Company. And we all remember who Lord Cornwallis was, right? He surrendered to George Washington at Yorktown in 1781, ending the American Revolution. Smarting from his loss of a major colony, Cornwallis led campaigns against Mysore and infused the British with a new sense of duty, nationalism, and empire. Cornwallis was also more aggressive after the new revolutionary French Republic made Tipu Sultan Citoyen Tipu, or an honorable citizen Tipu, a clear case of emboldening England's enemies. Cornwallis led an initial defeat of Tipu Sultan in 1792 by exploiting disaffected Indian mercenaries with prospects of better, more regular pay under the company. Cornwallis actually captured Tipu's two sons, which Robert Home made into a famous painting to glorify the British general. As a spoil of war, the company was granted the divan, or the right to collect revenue, of half of Mysore territory. This made it easier for the company to finance further wars. A final war was fought in 1799 in which the company proved victorious. Crucially, it received assistance from scribal and banking groups within Mysore. When the company ran dangerously low on supplies and money, Hindu moneylenders helped them out. Plus, Tipu Sultan died in his last stance against the company army. And as a symbolic reward to those largely Hindu groups that helped the company, the British removed Muslim rule and restored the original Hindu dynasty that Hyder Ali had conquered in the 1750s. Now, let's turn to another central and western Indian power that confronted the company, the Maratha Confederacy. The Marathas were the last major power who could challenge the British in central India. The British were concerned as they not only held lots of territory, but they also treated bankers and lending families better than other regional rulers. And being a largely warrior peasant kingdom, they could mobilize the masses. Indeed, they attempted to invade Mysore in 1770 with nearly 80,000 troops. Between 1774 and 1818, the company and the Marathas fought a series of 3 different wars. But things really started to move in the company's favor when Arthur Wellesley, the first Duke of Wellington, became the Governor-General of the East India Company in 1798. Wellington's arrival was a turning point in Indian history. He was imbibed with a strong sense of British nationalism. He envisioned a British dominion across the entire Indian subcontinent. And remember what was going on in Europe in the 1790s. Wars led by and against France. The European context was important. According to Wellington, Britain's wars against Napoleon and the threat of revolutionary France meant that the British had to be more aggressive in India. And Wellington demonstrated this by inaugurating a second war against the Marathas, largely as a pretext to keep French influence out. In the wars against the Marathas, the company again exploited the questionable loyalties of relatives within the Maratha bureaucracy. The company promised them enhanced landed and commercial privileges. Human intelligence was crucial, and here the British quickly co-opted the Indian networks of runners, spies, and informants to their great advantage. And in 1803, in wars against the Marathas, the British captured the ancient city and capital of India, Delhi. They did this, they claimed, to protect the Mughal emperor from the Marathas. Now this was significant, for it symbolically showed that while technically part of the Mughal system, the company was the real Sarkar, or authority, in India. Finally, in 1817 and 1818, the company fought a final war to finally subdue the Marathas in central India. In fact, they used the attacks of recently unemployed horsemen known as Pindaris against company outposts as a final excuse to crush the Marathas. So removed was the last real threat to the company. By 1820, large swaths of southern, northern, and western India were now company land. Within 2 generations of Plassey, the company had become the dominant power in South Asia. They were what Indians called the Sarkar, the authority. Of course, this raises the question, why did Indian groups help the British conquer large parts of their lands? Well, the answer is very complicated. What we see is that merchants and bankers withdrew their support for regional Indian states and shifted towards the company. Why? To them, British rule looked better and more commercially stable. Generally, as we have seen, a lot of Indian rulers bled merchants and moneylenders until their eyes bulged. But did the company conquer all of India? No. It was well nigh impossible for any power to do that, be they foreign or Indian. When it came to kingdoms that the company could or could not choose to engage with militarily, the company used its fiscal and financial tools to keep them in a fairly subservient position. And the best example was seen with the kingdom of Awadh. The company did this through something called the Subsidiary Alliance. It was used in Hyderabad, Mysore, and the Maratha Confederacy, but it was in Awadh where the screws were turned tightest. Here's how it worked. In order to protect these kingdoms from other powers, the company forced Indian rulers to station British troops in their territories, and the Indian kings had to foot the bill. What this was, if we scratch beneath the surface, was really a facade to put these kingdoms into a perpetual debt cycle. Putting troops in another kingdom's land not only kept them under check, but as the economist John Maynard Keynes observed, it also put them in the company's pocket. It bound these kingdoms into the fiscal might of the company. And of course, there was the prospect that they could not keep up with these payments, and they would need to borrow more money. Now, what Indian groups would benefit from putting Indian rulers into debt? Well, think about it. The very Hindu moneylenders and financiers who helped propel the company to power. The company effectively pushed these Indian states into the arms of bankers and moneylenders. And they would be more than happy to collaborate with the British to extract favorable financial benefits from their indebted sovereigns. Awadh was a perfect example. The kingdom was technically in alliance with the company after the British defeat of them at Buxar in 1764. In return for a massive subsidy, the company maintained its troops in the kingdom. But the financial strain and company demands alienated not only zamindars against the Nawab of Awadh, but also the bankers and merchant families themselves. And in theory, what would debts give the company the pretext to do? Well, what else? To eventually take over. And as a result of these financial strains of paying bills to Calcutta, Awadh ceded lush territories to the company in 1801. It was more than half the kingdom. This was one example of how the company utilized a debt trap to bring areas like Awadh under their own influence, if not outright control. And these ceded territories of the Gangetic Plain potentially brought untold revenues to the company's coffers. Now that we've covered the conquests of the company and how they exploited existing dynamics in order to become the dominant power by 1820, let's now lastly look at how the company governed now that they were effectively ruling this territory. Acquiring all this territory was one thing, on the one hand. Effectively taxing and administering it was a whole other matter. Remember, throughout history, taxes have rarely been forcibly taken from cultivators. And India was no different. The Mughal revenue system, which the British inherited, was sophisticated. It was paper and pen-based. It had massive amounts of records, even if they varied regionally. This whole system had a sophisticated, flexible taxation administration. It involved collectors, cultivators, assessors, and paper managers. This is what had made the Mughals initially wealthy and powerful. And the successful kingdoms of the 18th century inherited these traditions in modified forms, such as in places Bengal, Awadh, and the Maratha territories. Now that the British ruled these former imperial domains, what would they need to know about taxation in India? What fiscal and revenue intelligence would they need? all the records and practices of assessment, the ability to pay, payment schedules, when taxes were collected, the whole IRS codebook, as it were. The British quickly moved to employ former Hindu scribes and paper managers who served the Mughals and their successor states. In North India, they overwhelmingly came from a Hindu caste called Kayasthas. These pensmen provided the company with valuable rent rolls, records of past assessment, and the paper factual sanction to enact revenue demands. This was a whole other world of fiscalism that the company had to learn once they conquered these territories. They were quickly drawn into the matters of landholding rights, methods of assessment, enforcement of payment, and inheritance. In the Gangetic lush plains of North India, the company quickly utilized the skills and paperwork of these scribes to give them an idea of what the tax rates were and what the company could get away with charging. In fact, most revenue archives from Awab after 1803 have constant references by the British to, quote, what the Nawab's domains yielded previously. These Kayasthas were some of the first Indians to be employed by the company, and they were quickly transferred over to the company's administration. As we will see later, these subordinate lowly scribes and pensmen provided the early colonial state with the paperwork needed to enact savage revenue demands upon the Indian farmer. So in this lecture, we've looked at how the company came to power in Bengal, exploiting existing 18th century dynamics. We've seen how the company was transformed from a commercial into a political power in Bengal. And we saw how it used tax resources to successfully fight wars against other regional kingdoms. We've also seen how the company quickly employed pre-existing scribes and tax officials to govern and administer their territories. As a result of the events between 1760 and 1820, the company rode the wave of the regionalized Indian state system with its military fiscalism, merchant and banking families. In effect, the company did what all other regional states were doing in the 18th century, but the British did it better. The British, in a way, worked the landscape to go from a trading entity to a political power by 1820. So it's in this context that we should see the transition to colonialism. Not one of pure conquest, but one of exploiting dynamics. Of course, this leads us to ask, why were Indians not suspicious of the company's ulterior motives? It's a very good question. The company concealed its ambitions. It never used the symbols and vestiges of Mughal sovereignty. Indian rulers didn't believe the company had political ambitions. They thought it was merely offering its services for hire. Of course, its trading interests were stretched to absurd degrees. When the company felt its trading position was threatened, it often resorted to force. But there was an inherent conflict of interest for the company in India. For one, it was not an Indian power. They had no sentimental or moral attachment to the well-being of Indians. This made the company different from all previous rulers before them. The other complication was its obligations. Being a publicly traded company with investors, the company had a primary responsibility to its shareholders. And it was this inherent tension between its role as a merchant organization and as a political sovereign that greatly shaped its rule of India up through the 1850s.